Hello and welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you have tuned in tonight. My name is Sky Perryman. I'm a lawyer and the president and CEO of Democracy Forward. We are so happy to have you on our virtual town hall, Democracy, the Supreme Court, and the path forward. And let me tell you that last part, the path forward, is what is really important tonight. We're going to talk about this last Supreme Court term, the work that so many advocates are doing every single day at this critical time in our country and at this critical time for people. We are also going to talk about the path forward. There are more than 2,000 people registered for tonight's event, and the count keeps going up. And we have people from across the country, folks in really big cities, in small towns, in red states, in blue states, people from all over. And that continues to tell us at Democracy Forward about the need and desire that we are all feeling in these times to build community and to be together with each other. And the thing about building a community is that it's important not just for our own selves as people. It is important at this moment for the very existence of our democracy. There are actors out there, politicians, presidents, movements that want you to feel alone and isolated. And we know that we are not alone, that we are a part of a community, that we stand shoulder to shoulder with each other. And that is really what tonight is about. But we're also going to get educated and hear from a range of guests who are going to help us process what just happened in this Supreme Court term, what is happening across this country, and how lawyers and advocates and people and communities are pushing back and building forward even in this difficult time. I thought I would start with just some observations before we turn it over to just some phenomenal guests who have given their evenings tonight to be with all of you. We are just so honored. Some observations on this Supreme Court term. And let me first start, and I think our colleagues from Democracy Forward who are helping us with this town hall tonight will put this in the chat for all of you. But I'll start with just saying that we have at Democracy Forward just released an update to our standard People's Guide to the Supreme Court. We've issued a summer update where you can read and access information about what is happening and what has happened at the Supreme Court, and some look ahead information as well. You can find that on our website at democracyforward.org/SCOTUS, SCOTUS. And I know that link will be in the chat. I'll start with just some basic observations, and then we'll turn it over to what promises to be a great discussion. And just thank you again to so many of you who are giving of your evening to be in community with us in this time. The first thing that I'll just note as we look at this Supreme Court term are the two different types of cases that we see. We see cases on what we call the merits docket. These are the cases that you might listen in on the oral argument, you understand who is filing the briefs, and the court issues decisions and dissenting opinions that everyone reads and can understand whether we agree with them or disagree with them. We can really understand what the court is doing and what that means for people. And so we have some leading experts tonight who will be able to help us process what we have seen in some key cases on that court's merit docket. But we also have what is often called the shadow docket or the emergency docket, where the Supreme Court in recent years has been taking just an inordinate amount of cases on this emergency docket. Historically, this is a docket that was reserved for pretty limited circumstances. And now you have the Supreme Court at the invitation in many instances of the Trump-Vance administration taking just a high volume of cases on its emergency docket, where it's issuing orders that often it's not hearing argument on or getting full briefing on, where it's not explaining what it is doing. It's not issuing full decisions, that shadow docket. And so we would be remiss tonight if we didn't talk a little bit about the shadow docket, because it is really a docket where we are seeing right now the Supreme Court be quite active, and where the Trump-Vance administration is trying to turn as it is losing in courts across the country because of its unlawful and harmful activity. And so we will talk about the significant impact that the shadow docket's having. And as we look at this term, one observation is just that we're continuing to see a range of cases emerging on that docket. Just earlier today, in a case that Democracy Forward is litigating alongside so many of our wonderful co-counsel and partners, the Supreme Court issued a shadow docket decision that could potentially enable the president to continue to terminate people across the federal government. We're gonna see what happens there, because we're going to continue to fight in court. But this is something that affects every single person, and a thing that we're seeing in these trends. So that is just to note that one trend that we've seen this term is just an increased use in the shadow docket, particularly as the Supreme Court has started receiving so many emergency filings from the Trump-Vance administration. A second observation, as we've looked across the term, is that we do see that the Supreme Court has actually reversed a range of decisions that the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit have issued across a range of issues, whether that is in the Braidwood decision, where we saw the Supreme Court uphold the Affordable Care Act's preventive services structure, copay-free preventive services for healthcare. The court upheld that in a 6-3 decision, which we will talk about tonight. Or whether it is in the Vanderstock decision, where the court upheld a federal regulation from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF, that would allow the regulation of gun kits. So we are seeing, and then also the Supreme Court reversed a decision that the Fifth Circuit issued, and reversed a decision that's quite helpful for many individual rights and for Fourth Amendment protection. So one trend we're seeing, we're going to get to some of the things that are a bit disappointing about this term, but one trend that we see is the court continuing at times to reverse very extreme decisions that the Fifth Circuit has issued, and we think that marks another sort of trend to look at. And the other thing that we'll point out before we get into the details of this term and what the cases and what they mean with some of our experts is that we know that the American people are losing some confidence in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's approval ratings have been at historic lows for several years now. People look to the Supreme Court to protect the rights of people, to protect our democratic institutions. And when the Supreme Court doesn't do that reliably, we do have a legitimacy crisis. But at the same time that we have that, we are also seeing with this administration, where an administration, the Trump-Vance administration, in courts across the country, where courts are issuing rulings to stop their abuses of power, the administration at times is ignoring those court orders, and the American people have no tolerance for that. And there is polling that has come out from many sources that show that the vast majority of people in this country believe that the president and that our government should have to follow court orders just like all of us. And that many people, 2/3 of the American public, are really concerned that this administration is leading us into a constitutional crisis between the executive branch and the courts. And so I mentioned that to say that we know that we have a lot of work to do to protect the rights of people, and that people in this country are still looking to the courts to do that. And they get quite disappointed and worried when we have a president and an administration that does not respect the rule of law. We know in our cases at Democracy Forward, and some of the cases that our advocates here tonight will talk about, that while the Supreme Court is incredibly powerful and does get to set precedent throughout the United States, that it's not the only court that we all look to protect our rights. And at Democracy Forward, at organizations like the ACLU, you'll get to hear from Cecilia Wang tonight, the legal director at the ACLU, from our state AGs, who you will get to hear from one of our state attorneys general tonight. We are using the courts every single day to protect the American people, to make sure that people have a voice. And what we are seeing in our work is that courts across the country, judges that are appointed by Republican presidents, judges that have been appointed by Democratic presidents, judges that have been appointed by President Trump himself, courts across the country are stepping in, these district courts are stepping in to protect the American people, to preserve our Constitution and to really use the rule of law for justice. And so while we are going to focus on the Supreme Court tonight, because we've heard from you and we know you have a lot of questions, we do want to make sure that people understand that the Supreme Court matters, but it is not the only courtroom that matters. And we will be in all the courtrooms every single day on behalf of the American people and so many advocates along with us who are excited to get to introduce you to tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our first guest, who I think will come on the screen here, who is a legal director at Democracy Forward. He recently joined our team, Brian Netter. We are so incredibly excited to have him at Democracy Forward. He most recently served as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Division at the U.S. Department of Justice. So he was representing the American people in court when the Justice Department was doing its best to protect the rights of people. And we are so incredibly grateful that he's joined our team at Democracy Forward as the legal director. So thank you, Brian, not only for joining us, but also for joining us here tonight. And I'd love to just start to have you talk to folks that are tuning in about sort of how you, throughout the course of your career, I know you clerked on the court and you've been at law firms where you did appellate work and you've obviously been at the Department of Justice, how you've seen the Supreme Court's role shift and what concerns you might have or opportunities you may see when you look at this term and when you think about what it means for people and for our democracy as a whole.
Thank you, Sky, and thanks to everybody who's using their Tuesday night to think about the Supreme Court with us today. I think one of the things that's most notable about the Supreme Court is not just how it decides particular cases, but the fact that the court, for the most part, gets to decide whether to rule in a particular case. So there are some 400,000 new cases that will be filed in any given year in the federal district court. You mentioned the merits docket before, Sky. Those are the cases where the Supreme Court will hold argument and issue a formal opinion. The court only ends up hearing about 60 or 70 cases out of a pool of more than 400,000 that are working their way up through the courts of appeals in any given year. So what the justices decide to use as their focal point, what cases they decide to decide, is a key indicator of what the court views as its role in American society and in our system of government. So when I was a law clerk for now retired Justice Breyer, the principles that were drilled into us, not just by Justice Breyer, but by all the justices as a collective, were first of all, that the court isn't in the business of deciding issues in what's called an interlocutory posture. So when legal issues arise in the middle of a case, the court at that time wasn't interested in deciding those issues because it may prove unnecessary ever for the court to intervene. And the court was really a court of last resort that shouldn't be jumping into the fray unnecessarily. And the other principle was that the Supreme Court is not a court of error correction. So the justices would tell us all the time that it was not our job to look for cases where we thought that the outcome was wrong, because the role of the court was to create national uniformity. So when there were different parts of the country where the law meant different things, those were the cases where the Supreme Court should get involved, not just circumstances in which there was some one-off decision that the justices disagreed with. Now, it's hard to look at the array of cases that the court is taking today, either on the merits docket or through its actions on the shadow docket, and believe that those principles are still accurate. Right? We see the court jumping in earlier and earlier, sometimes, frequently now, hopping over lower courts and issuing seemingly dispositive rulings in cases sometimes weeks after they've been filed. This is very much inconsistent with the traditional practices of the Supreme Court, and the traditional practices were grounded in a desire to insulate the court from politics. And the court still would not describe itself as a political institution. But surely if the justices are weighing in on policies within a month of when they have come out, before all the facts have been developed, before all the legal arguments have been developed, and frequently without hearing oral argument at all, it necessarily turns the court into a body that's going to be more influenced by the political views of the day. The other thing substantively that I think we see from this court is a willingness to deviate from settled expectations. And that's true not just in terms of the court overruling precedents, including super precedents that we all believed were the sort of thing that never could and that certainly never should be overruled by the court, but also a willingness to change procedures and to change the role of the court, based on what the political climate is. It changes the gestalt of what the court is as an institution, and I think changes the way that we all interact with the court as a body.
That's so interesting, Brian. And I was just reading a few days ago that for like 16 years between the Obama administration and the Bush administration, there were very few, and I think this is what you were alluding to, there were very few cases that were being taken on that emergency docket. And then we just started seeing a flood, the first Trump administration sort of trying to flood that docket. We see that now. And then, of course, we have these other, these other trends as well. That's one thing I wanted to ask you about. I know that you were at the Department of Justice, I believe, when Dobbs came out. I mean, everybody can remember back there. It seems like Dobbs is continues to be a concern, and we're also living in a world of a lot of concerns right now. But it seems like at times the courts are being used, or at least the Supreme Court is at times being used to sort of delay or dismantle safeguards or rights. And so how do you think about, as a litigator, litigation strategy in that landscape when the courts at some points might be part of the problem, or at least the Supreme Court? I mean, how do you sort of think about that?
If we take a step back and look at how the court has evolved, I think many would attribute some of the legal decisions, some of the precedents that have been abandoned to long crafted plans of a legal movement that are being implemented in large part through the court. But the bottom line is that even if we're unhappy with the decisions that the court is issuing in particular cases or as to particular doctrines, the court is still an essential part of the American system of government. And we can't stop presenting the important questions to the court because we fear that we aren't going to like the answers that the court is going to provide. Now, many of the answers that the court is providing these days is that it views the power of the political branches, the president and to a lesser extent Congress, to be much larger than we had previously anticipated. And in a world in which the courts are less of a check on the excesses of the political branches than we thought that they were, it just puts all the more emphasis on political organizing. Elections always matter, but elections matter a lot more when the people you're electing have greater authority to make rapid change.
That's right. The people, we always say. And so I'm just going to leave with this question. And I think, some of our audience members know you, Brian, but you were the chair of a practice group at a large law firm, and you've worked at the highest levels of government. And now you're with us at Democracy Forward, which we're so excited about. And so I know that means that you have to have some hope in the legal system and in the role that the legal system plays, because I think you probably wouldn't be doing this every day. And folks that are tuning in tonight, many people are coming here because they're trying to figure out what to think, and they're trying to find where there might be hope, or at least understand where folks like us may continue to have a little bit of hope. So can you talk a little bit about any kind of hope that you see in the work that we're doing or in the legal system, and sort of how you would encourage folks that are tuning in on their night tonight to talk about the courts, to look at these issues?
Absolutely. So we think about the court colloquially as the last word on these big legal issues, but it's very rare when the Supreme Court decides something that it actually decides all parts of the issues. There are always these follow-up questions or the holes, gaps in the reasoning that are left for another day. And one of our jobs as lawyers is to figure out what questions did the court answer, what questions are still open, and how can we help courts reach the right answers on the questions that are still left open to move the legal direction, move the legal system in a direction that is most beneficial toward individual rights and the constitutional powers and protections that we all hold so dear. The other thing I would point to people who are feeling dispirited by some of the Supreme Court decisions is just to remember that even though it feels like the court is making a final ruling in some area, the legal system is in a sense a pendulum, that each generation of courts is responding to the generation before it, and it tends to happen that there are adjustments that are made by one court that are always too big than they needed to be to respond to what the previous court had done. So the pendulum may be swinging in one direction now, but it will swing back. And as they say, or as Dr. King once said, the arc of the moral universe will indeed bend toward justice if we just give it enough time. So the biggest concern, the biggest threat that we face is in complacency. And I know that the folks who are listening to us tonight aren't complacent and are eager to keep fighting. And it's so important, especially in a universe where the court is taking on issues that are of greater political prominence, and when there need to be lawyers who are continuing to fight after the Supreme Court has issued preliminary or seemingly final decisions. But there's plenty of room for hope, and I look forward to hearing what our other panelists have to say.
Well, thank you. You give us hope, and we know that it bends towards justice if we bend it, and I know that you and the team are bending it every day. So thank you so much, Brian, for joining us. I am super excited to get to introduce this community. Many of you know him already, but to Chris Geithner, the publisher and author of Law Dork. And if you don't subscribe to Law Dork, you should. And Chris will tell us how we can do that. But Chris is one of the most trusted voices on reporting on the Supreme Court and its impact on people in our democracy. I think one of the reasons he is most trusted is because he tells it like it is. And so we are so happy to have you here, Chris. Thank you for joining us. And I'll just ask you, as somebody that yeah, we're super happy that you're here. And I know the audience is too. You're always by popular demand, but maybe you could just start for us about how you are looking at the mainstream media's reporting on this year's Supreme Court term, and what you would want this audience to take away from it, what nuance you might have about it. I think that would be a great place for us to start.
Yeah. First, Sky, just thanks so much. I think that for everybody listening, it's definitely the past 6 months have been a nonstop intensive experience for all of us working on every side of covering or litigating against government. And I think that's also part of my answer, is that I think some of the difficulty for the mainstream media has been figuring out how to write about this moment, how to cover what's happening in a way that both reflects reality and does what they feel like they've always done. And this is something that certainly when we talk about criticisms of the court, that some of its problems, aside from just the hard right turn it's taken now, are institutional problems. And I think that that's some of the problems that we see in mainstream legacy media in particular, is that there is sort of this instinctive, how do we explain what they did that makes sense? And sometimes, if you go to today's shadow docket ruling, I published a report at Law Dork this afternoon that's really brief, so go check it out. But Justice Jackson is the sole dissent, and basically says, what are you doing? You're letting Trump take a wrecking ball to the federal workforce before the lawsuit is decided. I haven't had a chance to see how the other media have covered it, but I think that it's allowing people who are willing to say what's happening, to speak to that reality is important. And I'm really glad that, like, from my platform at LawDork, that like I do have 15 years of experience covering the court from DC, from major publications for other major publications part-time. And it now being able to do it at LawDork, like I have the comfort of saying what I think needs to be said at any given moment, whereas I think some of the people at mainstream publications might be pushed back from saying that directly at times.
So let me just kind of dive into that, because you have written articles that I've read and that many of our audience members have read at LawDork about some of the unanimous decisions that have been made by the Supreme Court, and like what conflict that might hide. And we did see some unanimous decisions this time. So could you talk a little bit about that? And maybe also, just for our audience that's tuning in, of course, they're going to the People's Guide and looking at these things. It's fine to kind of talk about those cases too, but sort of what do you want people to understand potentially about some of these unanimous decisions that we see, where we see 8-0 or 9-0 decisions?
Yeah, I mean, the fact is, like, you'll hear, and this goes back to those mainstream publications. Lots of the times you'll see them highlight that, like, oh, well, more than 50% of the cases the court decides are unanimous, and it's like, well, a third of those are like cases about jurisdiction and deadlines, and while some of those have important ramifications for parties, they tend to be like, what does this word mean? And if Congress disagrees, they can change it. But importantly, when you get unanimous rulings in cases that people did pay attention to, we had a unanimous decision in the case over education disability discrimination cases. We had a unanimous decision in the case over the Wrong House raid down in Georgia, where the people whose house was raided, even though there was no warrant for their house, they weren't the people being sought by the warrant even, that both of those decisions were unanimous. But neither of them really resolved the issue. And I think Brian alluded to this as well, that a lot of the times what comes out of a decision, and it's something to really look at when you get a unanimous decision, is did people write concurring opinions? Was there something in the majority opinion that said explicitly, we're not resolving this issue today? And in both of those cases that I highlighted, I wrote about it at LawDork, there were situations in the Wrong House raid case. Justice Gorsuch, in his majority opinion, basically said, like, we're not deciding a lot here, and so the case itself wasn't resolved for that family who was subject to the Wrong House raid, and the larger issue wasn't resolved. And so that's why it was unanimous. They basically said, well, the 11th Circuit got this really wrong, but there are a lot of questions left. And the other situation with the disability case, basically they resolved one top line question, but there was this underlying dispute that that sort of the concurring opinion suggested that a future case could ultimately either make things better for people bringing disability cases or much, much worse.
And that's that national uniformity piece that Brian alluded to that we don't get sometimes after these cases. They're a bit unsatisfying at times. So we're going to talk in a moment to Cecilia Wang, National Legal Director at the ACLU, who's like such a champion for so many of us, for all of us. And I know she'll talk about some of the cases that are like on the front lines, really reported. So I wanted to just ask you before we get to her, talk to me about some of the cases that you don't think were as heavily reported as they should have been by mainstream media. Like, what do you want folks that are tuning in on their evening tonight to know that maybe they don't just glean from the headlines? If you could just talk to us a little bit about those types of cases that you think the American people should know more about.
Yeah, I think one of the real interesting through lines at the end of the term that I think got jumped on a little by the fact that they released 6 decisions on the last day, and then they had these follow-up days, and one of those big decisions that last day was obviously the birthright citizenship case that ended up being about universal injunctions. But there was also this important decision, Mahmoud versus Taylor, about LGBTQ inclusive text, not even textbooks, but books that were a part of the curriculum in a Maryland school. And you had this decision that came from the far right part of the court, was authored by Justice Alito, that was sort of portrayed as this like great parental rights decision, that parents have a right to know what is happening to their kids at school. And it was really interesting that decision came out on Friday, and sort of the dissent from Justice Sotomayor talked about like the chaos that this could create in actually implementing it in schools going forward. But then the next Monday, the Supreme Court, in the aftermath of the Scrimetti decision on Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming medical care for trans minors, in that case, the court only decided a question of equal protection, but the individual trans minors and their parents who had sued had asked the court also to take up a parental rights case under that sort of same rubric. And on Monday, the Monday after the Mahmoud decision, the Supreme Court denied that case without even considering it. They didn't take it up. And while it's not a ruling on the merits because it was a cert denial, they just didn't take the case. They left a lower court ruling stand against that parental rights argument. They didn't take it up. And it really sent a pretty strong message that there are one set of parental rights claims that we're going to take very seriously, upend First Amendment precedent to protect them. And then when it comes to applying past precedent to protect parents of LGBTQ people who want basic protections, we're not even going to take that case up. And I think that's an example of paying attention not only to the cases that they take, but the cases that they turn down.
Well, thank you so much. For folks that are tuning in, I think many of you already read Chris's work, but you can find it at lawdart.com. And we are so grateful that you took time out tonight to help read us into some of the not so obvious conclusions from this Supreme Court term.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for coming. And so I'm now going to welcome, I think I'll bring Cecilia Wang, who is the National Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union. Cecilia has spent her entire career fighting for what matters, from immigrants' rights to racial justice to our Constitution. She and her team are on the front lines of this fight every day. We so enjoy working with the ACLU when we get an opportunity to work together, and we so appreciate all that they're holding up across the country in this time. So thank you so much for joining us, Cecilia.
You have to be together, Sky.
Yes, and this is not the first front line you've been on. So let's kind of maybe take a step back, as folks are, I think, hoping that we will do tonight. During President Trump's first term, I mean, you and your team and colleagues fought and challenged the Muslim ban, the border wall, family separation policies, and we're back at it again. Every single day. Can you talk to folks that are trying to process, like, what are some of the differences and what are some of the similarities that you're seeing as a legal strategist and a legal director in the way that this administration is operating in sort of the second term?
So I'll offer two quick differences between Trump 1 and Trump 2, and one similarity that hopefully will be inspiring and give people some hope. I think the two differences, obviously, are that the volume and the viciousness of the Trump administration's attacks on marginalized minority communities' rights and liberties is just on a different level. The Trump administration came in prepared, acting as if there are no holds barred, no regard for due process, for equal protection, for the rule of law. And we can see that in addition to individual rights and liberties, you see due process and the rule of law taking heavy collateral damage in these attacks on these minority groups like transgender youth or undocumented immigrants. From day one, the president attacked the Reconstruction Constitution, literally attacked the 14th Amendment's birthright citizenship guarantee. And he also attacked on day one the protections of the second Reconstruction. For example, rescinding President Johnson's executive order that did away with discrimination in the federal contracting process, to take one of many, many examples. The second difference is, of course, that the Trump administration is attacking mainstream institutions that are part of the fabric of our free country. Corporate law firms, major media companies, universities, and courts and federal judges, and as well as elected officials, as we've seen with really appalling instances of over policing and censorship. So those are the two differences I see. And I would say that one similarity is that robust litigation responses, among other responses, as Brian alluded to, have been really paying off. And courts are enjoining unlawful actions and policies of this administration more often than they are letting them go forward, despite having some major losses, especially recently in the Supreme Court. But I think that is something that we have in common between these two terms.
Let's talk about like this term, and you and your team were really on the front lines of so many of these cases, but we saw cases impacting at least the fight over birthright citizenship. We know it was about injunctions, and you and I have both been active in trying to make people understand, like, it was a disappointing decision and it's not over, and there's a lot of options that exist, but sort of we saw rulings impacting that fight, LGBTQ rights, access to healthcare, public education, as Chris mentioned, and in so many of those cases, you all have played a role. What decisions, as you look out over the term, do you see some opportunity, new legal openings for resistance or for progress or for sort of that, the art of law? There's a little bit of an art and a science to law of how we can sort of even use in these decisions some opportunities to move forward.
Sure. So, our Trump docket and our Supreme Court docket overlap a bit, but not entirely. So the ACLU had 3 cases on the merits docket this term, and we filed amicus briefs in 11 more. And we had 5 cases on the emergency docket, including one that we're doing with Democracy Forward. I think, the obvious headline, as you've already said in talking with Chris, is that in major civil rights cases on the court's merits docket, we really saw those cases ending in absolute disasters for civil rights and civil liberties. But I want to say, to get to your question, these were not all unmitigated disasters. They are mitigated disasters.
Yes.
U.S. versus Crometti, which Chris mentioned, was a case where we argued alongside the federal government, which under the previous administration joined us in challenging Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming medical treatment for trans teens. And in this case, I think, the silver lining of the decision that literally stripped essential health care away from teenagers who had decided along with their parents and their physicians that this is what they needed as a medical matter, took that care away from them. Really a horrible and devastating loss for our clients and other trans teens and their families around the country. But there's a silver lining, and that is that the court did not do damage to the equal protection doctrine on sex discrimination, which was a risk in this litigation. And instead of holding, as Justice Barrett would have, that discrimination against trans Americans is subject to a lower level of constitutional scrutiny, the court said in the majority opinion by Chief Justice Roberts, this is not a classification based on sex. It's a classification based on age and medical use. And so we live to fight another day, and we will most immediately in our cases challenging bans on trans women and girls playing sports in BPJ and Hecox, 2 cases the court has already taken for next term.
Go ahead.
No, please.
So, I mean, this kind of transitions me into a question, and I know people are feeling hopeless. It's hard to look at these decisions, and maybe you were about to go to some of the options available in birthright, which we can talk about too. But like, what is your message? And it's I'm happy for you to talk about the term with this or otherwise, but like, what do you say? I mean, you are working with people and representing people every single day who are scared for themselves and their families and their neighbors. There are folks that are tuning in tonight that are feeling that. Like, what message do you want people to take away from the work that we're all doing, from the work that you're doing, from this term? What message would you share with folks? And if that relates to some of the cases, that's great too. So
yeah, I know we're running short on time, so let me cut to the chase. I think Chris alluded to a number of the lower profile cases this term where the court really sided with civil rights plaintiffs and criminal defendants. Key cases in Williams versus Reed, Martin versus U.S., which Chris mentioned, Pertu versus Richards, Hewitt versus U.S., Gloss versus Oklahoma. Chris kind of, described these as cases about what does this word mean in the statute, but they are enormously consequential for so many people in our country. So I'd urge that you read those. Our side prevailed in 6 of 11 cases where we filed amicus briefs. So while the court was, staking out these really bad positions on civil rights cases, major civil rights cases, they quietly did a lot of good in keeping the courthouse doors open for ordinary Americans in important matters. I would say to people who are feeling worried about the state of the Supreme Court and about our country and this president that, look, I don't presume to give advice to people who are directly affected, trans teens who had their health care taken away, or American families where U.S. citizen kids have seen their parents taken away in handcuffs because they're undocumented. There are many millions of people in this country who are standing together with you if you're directly affected. And I think that's all we can say. But I will say this, we're in it for the long haul. Every Supreme Court case, every Supreme Court decision, win or lose, is just one point on that arc of the moral universe that Brian was talking about, that Dr. King was talking about. And if you're feeling a sense of despair and feeling like our opponents who are going after civil rights and civil liberties are on top right now, just remember the history of what comes before us. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed on August 6, 1965, just a few months after Bloody Sunday, when John Lewis and other Black-led civil rights activists started out on their march from Selma to Montgomery in support of voting rights for Black Americans. It took our opponents 50 years to win Shelby County versus Holder. in 2013, which struck down Section 5 preclearance under the Voting Rights Act. And that battle is continuing. All of us together in the civil rights movement have been fighting and winning against voter suppression measures, against unfair legislative redistricting maps. So keep the faith. There are millions of Americans marching together to make progress. This is a long-term game. You never win civil rights once and for all. We have to be eternally vigilant in these fights.
Thank you, Cecilia, so much for joining us tonight, but also so much for what you and your team at the ACLU do. I know many people, me included, get a lot of hope and courage from watching you all in court. We love being side by side in the cases where we work together, and we feel also strong because of all the work that you all do, which you said is for the long game and hasn't changed from administration to administration. So thank you so much for giving your time and your night to be in community with us. And I will, while Cecilia is saying goodbye, I will bring on Attorney General Nick Brown from the state of Washington. We are so incredibly excited to have you, AG Brown. And just for those of you, he needs no introduction. I know you're familiar with the trailblazer that he is, but AG Brown made history as Washington State's first Black Attorney General and is really bringing a frontline perspective in a lot of the communities that we are in, and how these national rulings can impact people and communities in small towns and large cities and in the states. One thing that we want you to know here at Democracy Forward is that, yes, there are civil society groups like Democracy Forward and the ACLU that are going to be in court for you every single day. But there are also state AGs in many states that are doing the work of the people. I am from Texas originally. My state AG for my home state is not one of those AGs, but you are, AG Brown, and you're doing work for all of us, even people that are not in your state. So let me start by just thanking you for joining us tonight. And for being with us. And then I'll start by just asking you if you could help our audience that's tuning in understand how you and your team of lawyers and your office is preparing sort of not just for the legal impact of some of these decisions that are really disappointing in some cases, decisions that will affect LGBTQ youth or parents, teachers, immigrants, the list goes on, but how you're also preparing for the human impact of those decisions, and maybe what we could take with us as we're tuning in. Not everybody's an AG, but I think we could probably learn some lessons from you and your team.
Yeah, thank you, Sky. I really appreciate being here, and honored to listen to the other panelists this evening as well. And I appreciate the question, just to highlight that, as we talk about these legal and these academic issues, at the heart of all of the decisions that are being made by SCOTUS and frankly every court across the country are the impacts on people. And this term represents what a damaging impact Supreme Court term can have. And we're dealing time and time again with some of the most vulnerable populations that are bearing the brunt of the merits docket and the shadow emergency docket. And, it is incumbent upon myself and my colleagues across the country. Right now, there are 23 Democratic attorney generals, including the District of Columbia. It is incumbent upon us to advocate for them, not only on the legal issues, but to tell their stories. And, I always try to remind my team as we're advocating on these cases, and for the most part winning at the district court level and in the appellate court, and hopefully as they continue to SCOTUS, is that we need to be able to represent these people and tell their stories, because we are talking about the real erosion of their liberties, and our ability to advocate for them is built in large part on our relationship with the community, how well we are connected to both individuals and advocacy groups that represent people's interests. And, we have been able to quickly prepare and respond to so many executive orders that we've seen from the Trump administration, is because in my office, we've built a long-standing relationship with some of these groups that are advocating for the people that don't have power in this moment. And, it's a challenge, because we're asking a lot of them to, put their name and their stories in court documents that will last forever. But, our ability to get relief from some of these really egregious decisions and actions that we're seeing is built on that foundation. And, for me, the shining example was, our Washington State led the national challenge to the cuts to transgender healthcare at the state level. And we were able to move quickly and get immediate relief, not only because of the outstanding legal work in our team, but by the bravery of patients and doctors and institutions that were willing to have their stories told and, make it not just a legal issue about whether it's abuse of authority or an erosion of the separation of powers or affirmation of state sovereignty, but these were human impacts. And that is going to continue. And the other piece that I would say is, as we deal with these impacts as attorney generals, we're not only thinking about the legal issues, we're talking about the void that's going to be created because the state or federal government is no longer going to be supporting people and advocating for civil rights. I mean, the erosion of the civil rights unit of the Department of Justice, a place where I very much grew up in as a professional, to see the erosion of their mission and a real 180 turn on it, that burden is going to fall on states and attorney general's offices to be their advocates, but also on state government to now be trying to fund and support people. Nothing the president has done has changed a single law in Washington state. And I try to remind people that as we see this flurry of executive orders, Washington state and many of my colleague states continue to have really great state protections when it comes to issues like healthcare and transgender rights protections and environmental protections and civil rights. Nothing the president has done has changed a thing here. And so we need to make sure that we're balancing that impact and relying on what we can do at the state level to continue to tell the stories and to fight for those people who are going to be marginalized in this moment.
Well, I think that is something we all need to keep in mind. And there's such incredible work that's been happening in the states and in Washington state in particular. And for folks that are tuning in, I think people here are following, certainly following the Supreme Court and some of our work. But could you just talk a little bit about how you as an AG and your colleagues in other states as AGs, right, that get to go into court and litigate every single day on behalf of people, sort of how are you responding to this administration? I mean, I just want to make sure that folks that are tuning in really understand the role that the AGs are playing, and to some of the Supreme Court developments that, were a bit disappointing when we look at things like what the Supreme Court has done with access to courts on universal injunctions, but yet there are other pathways and other things we can do. So would love to hear if you could just make sure that folks are tuning into sort of the power that you all have and how you and your fellow state AGs are really taking up that mantle.
Yeah, no, I think if there's one key message that I'd like everybody watching today to take away from at least my portion of this is it is really important to have an attorney general in your state who is willing to advocate on these types of issues. It is so important now more than ever for a host of reasons. So a couple of things that I would just want to highlight for people is that, we've been at this now for almost 6 months, but really the ability of attorney general's offices across the country to advocate successfully and move quickly is because of all the preparation that occurred really over the year preceding, as attorney general's offices across the country, including here in Washington, dug down deep into Project 2025, which is being used repeatedly to advance administration policies currently. We looked closely at what was being said on the campaign trail by then candidate Trump, and teams across the country were digging into that and doing research and dividing that up and meeting to discuss these issues. And that allowed us to meet this moment head on. And, the other thing for people to remember is that we are fighting and fighting quickly and for the most part prevailing, not in every case. And we've taken some losses that are incredibly disappointing, but in the vast majority of cases that we brought, we've been able to prevail and get immediate relief. And the birthright citizenship order obviously was the first most impactful executive order signed on the very first day. Washington state led a coalition of states to sue the very next day because of the preparation that we had brought, got an immediate injunction in a couple of days thereafter, and have continued to litigate that, not only up to SCOTUS, but also continuing in the Ninth Circuit, where we briefed and argued that case to the Ninth Circuit. And so there's been just a ton of work that has moved forward over the last year and certainly in the last 6 months to get everybody prepared for this moment. We have seen, in addition to the real substantive changes, there's been a real erosion of simply access to justice. We saw that most recently in the CASA case around birthright citizenship, but we've seen that in a number of cases that both, all of my panelists preceding me have highlighted. And that is really disappointing, when we're talking about some foundational constitutional protections and rights that are going to be harming people, where the court almost seems to acknowledge that damage is going to be done. And, we saw that certainly in the dissent today from Justice Jackson and others. And it's been hard to see that narrowing of opportunity. Not that universal injunctions are universally loved by people, Democratic AGs. But when we're talking about foundational rights, to see access to justice be curtailed is really troubling. But it also just renews, in my belief, that it's really important to have AGs fighting. Your citizenship, your right to so many of the rights and liberties and freedoms that comes with being American is going to may very well depend on whether you're born in Washington State or Idaho to my east. What happens in the next 20 days as the courts continue to administer the impact of, frankly, a very bizarre ruling on universal injunctions. The idea that would turn on where you live is really troubling, but it reaffirms that states and state courts are important, developing firm records at the state level important, and frankly, just electing people who are going to advocate on your behalf really, really matters more than ever.
Thank you so much for joining us. And just before I make a few closing remarks, I know that you believe this because you're doing it every single day, that the courts do have this role in protecting people and in protecting democracy. And so maybe just to leave our audience with something, can you talk a little bit about that role? At Democracy Forward, we talk about the courts not just as a way of protecting people, but as a way of making their voices heard. And I know that you do that on behalf of the people in your state. So just really quickly, what message do you want people to know about you and so many like you that are going to fight every single day?
Yeah, I mean, I continue to have hope in this moment because I've seen the power, not only of the work that we're doing, but the power of the individual stories that we are able to tell. And, there are a lot of things that are going to get us past this moment and deal with the aftermath of this administration because the impacts are going to be lasting. It's going to be attorney generals, it's going to be lawyers, it's going to be groups like Democracy Forward and ACLU, it's going to be journalists like Chris. But at the end of the day, it's really going to be people. And it's going to be people saying the truth, fighting for their neighbors, even if they don't agree with their neighbors or know their neighbors. It's going to be community groups and individuals showing up at the local level. And, this is the one thing that I really want people to focus on is as much attention as we pay to DC and to SCOTUS, and with good reason, the things that you most care about are happening at the state and local level. 90% of the decisions around education and healthcare and environmental policy, criminal justice, those are being decided in your state legislature. And most people don't pay attention to that. And I really hope that people make their voices heard at their state capitals and their city and county governments. And that's how we affect change moving forward.
Thank you. And thank you for being such an example of that, AG Brown. And thank you for joining us. I want to thank everyone that tuned in tonight. Special people to tune in on a weeknight, late at night on the East Coast to learn more and to be in community. And we so appreciate it. At Democracy Forward, we are in court every single day on behalf of people and communities. We are never going to tell you that the courts are the number one silver bullet. We believe in the people, and we know that it's the people, all of us working together, that are going to make change. But we do know that our ability to get into court, to initiate litigation against our government, to shine a light when things are not operating in a transparent way, to give voice to people, it matters. It matters every single day. The setbacks that we have, and we had one earlier today, the setbacks that we have at our team at Democracy Forward, we say every day, if we're not experiencing some setbacks, we are not pushing hard enough for every single person in this country. And so our commitment to you as you're tuning in is that we're going to be working together with you and alongside so many groups to make sure that we're protecting people, that we're doing everything that we can in this moment. At our last town hall, for those of you that tuned into that town hall, we were at the 100th day of the Trump-Vance administration, and we launched something with all of you called Dinners for Democracy and Coffee for Change. And it's a little interesting. You're a legal organization. What are you doing launching Dinners for Democracy and Coffee for Change? But it was something that we heard from all of you, which is that the opportunity to be together and to be in community gives us the courage that we need to do the work in our local communities, as A.G. Brown was talking about, at the national level. It gives our team the courage to do the work in the courts every day. And so we wanted to make sure that you know that that initiative that you all took part in has been so incredibly successful. We have hundreds of hosts across the country in 49 states. If anyone online is from South Dakota, please let us know so that we can say 50 states next time I'm on a town hall. We encourage you to learn more about how you, with your community, can get together and be part of this change, especially change in your local communities, which is so important. You can learn more at democracyforward.org/dinners, which our team will put in the chat. They'll also make sure that you have a link to our People's Guide to this Supreme Court term. I also wanted to draw your attention to something else, another glimmer of hope, in addition to the hope that we get every day working on your behalf in the courts. Over the 4th of July holiday, we were privileged enough to be part of an effort called We Hold These Truths, which was a groundbreaking nationwide effort to promote the values of freedom and equality and democracy and a society that works for all of us, through providing people in this country with clear and reliable and accessible facts about the protections that all of us enjoy under the U.S. Constitution and the work that we all need to be doing and can do together to safeguard those freedoms that no one should be able to take away from us. We are co-chairing that effort, and it has already, just in a matter of days, gotten 18,000 people from across the country, people that do not agree on all things, coming together. We want you to learn more about that effort, and so you can learn more on the Democracy Forward website at democracyforward.org, or through weholdthesetruths.com. We hold these truths, or weholdtruths.com. Our team will be putting that in the chat to make sure that you can access it. We are so grateful for your community and for being with us today. Please be sure to stay in touch. Don't let yourself feel alone or without community. If you feel hopeless, we understand that, but don't let it last too long. Know that all of us are standing arm to arm with you, and we're going to be here, as Cecilio said, for the long haul. Thank you for joining. Learn more on our website at democracyforward.org, and know that we are just so grateful to be in community with you every single day.